Thank you for coming today. I'd like to welcome everybody for being here. I see Sean in the audience. Maybe his wife and their new little girl will be here soon, I hope. Anyhow, as we have done in the past, I'd like to invite everybody to the altar to pray for the future of our church and for our next pastor. So at this time, I'd like to invite everybody to the altar, or you can pray at your seats. Thank you. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. We have Tim and Barbara Downs, our missionaries to the Ivory Coast of Africa. They are here with us this morning. He will be sharing his presentation with us, and he will give us a sermon after, a lesson afterwards, all right? So thank you for being here. We're ready for our next song. Thank you.
All right, let's grab our hymnals. Turn over to page number 497. 497, As the Deer. Let's sing it twice through.
At this time, I'd like to see if we have any visitors here. There's a coffee mug with candies in it that we'd like to present to you. So at this time, if you are a visitor, can you please raise your hand? I am looking, I don't see any hands being raised. So I guess it's just us. So thank you very much.
We're going to do a scripture song at this time. We're just going to do one this morning. It's 1 Thessalonians chapter number 5, 16 through 22. We'll have the words up there. Let's sing out this morning. Let's all stand again, grab your hymnals, turn over to page number 571. 571. When we all get to heaven. Amen. Let's sing out. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansion bright and blessed, will prepare for us a place. We all get to heaven. What a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let's shake hands.
hang by a thread at the end of my rope. And I'm losing my grip, and I've lost all hope. Along comes the strength beyond my control. Oh, that's what Jesus is. With the scoundrels and drunkards, lepers and me, on a hill far away between a couple of thieves, the last place on earth you'd think he would be. But that's right where Jesus is. The Prince of Peace and perfect love, that's who he is. And where I run, I can't count the ways that I'm not enough. But thank God, oh thank God, Jesus is. When I'm walking back guilty from the places I go, with no hesitation he welcomes me home. He's not afraid to get mud on his road. That's just how Jesus is. The Prince of Peace and perfect love, that's who he is. And where I run, I can't count the ways that I'm not enough. But thank God, oh thank God, Jesus is. The Prince of Peace and perfect love, that's who he is. And where I can't count the ways that I'm not enough. But thank God, oh thank God, Jesus is. Jesus is.
At this time, we're going to show a video of his work, and then when the video is over, Tim Downs is going to come up and bring us a message. Thank you. Guys ready?
While in ministry as a young family, we became increasingly aware of the need for cross-cultural church planters in an ever-expanding world. It was while we were praying to that end, wondering if maybe God could have a role for us in that God confirmed his call on our lives in the spring of 1984. We had no idea what that journey would look like. When God confirmed his call for us to go to Congo, DRC, we thought that this would be the plan for the rest of our lives. Now with this list of opportunities growing almost daily, the role that you play in our life and ministry has become increasingly important. Until recently, most of our church planting efforts were focused in three primary places: in Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, and in Belgium. The churches in Congo have already expanded into Congo-Brazzaville. There are Bible schools, training institutions in Congo, in Congo-Brazza, in Cote d'Ivoire. We've begun planting churches in Western Europe. We have an orphanage in Cote d'Ivoire, a manna feeding center. Our son Tim is increasing the orphanage movement in Cote d'Ivoire and elsewhere. But now there are new opportunities opening. And we're seeking wisdom and guidance in how God will move in these new areas. Almost daily, we become aware of new opportunities. There are still more than 6,900 unreached people groups in the world. The problem is that 5,900 of those are living in restricted access nations. Somehow, we've got to find a way to reach behind these closed doors, these restrictive doors. One of those ways is finding those people that are displaced from those restricted countries, living in countries that are open to the gospel. And that requires haste.
We're so happy to be back. It's been a long time, and we're just thrilled to be back. I have to show the video like that, otherwise I get up here and I forget that I'm supposed to show video. And I'm the proverbial absent-minded professor. I was the kid who never had his library book on the day that it was due, never had my report card signed. I would put my library book in front of the door on the floor so I wouldn't miss it and go out a different door. Just how it is. God has done some extraordinary things. I mentioned during the Sunday school hour that this church has supported us since the very beginning. That means 38 years that you have supported us faithfully, and so much that God has done as a result of that. It does require a partnership like that. There's no way to go if somebody doesn't send you, and so we share alike. That impresses me so much, that idea. Turn with me, if you would, to Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14. This morning, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about facing the unfinished task. We live in a world where I mentioned in the video nearly 7,000 people groups that have no gospel witness, virtually of any kind. And some of them are very isolated, some not so much. In my own country of Ivory Coast, there are several people groups that have no gospel witness, primarily because they are resistant. In the northwest corner of our country, it's 90% Muslim. In the northeast corner of our country, it's 90% animist, which is local traditional religions, and they're resistant to the gospel. So it makes it more challenging. You have missionaries that work in places where it's illegal to be a missionary. We call them workers. The word missionary, if you say that, you can tell by the look on their face that it's like you just cussed at them. I mean, they do not want to hear that word because it's illegal to be there. It's illegal. It's a capital crime to change your religion. And so we live in a world where still 2/3 of the world have never heard a clear presentation of the gospel. It's hard for us to get our minds around that because the gospel is everywhere for us. And I know that our world is not what it was 40 years ago. I understand that. But nonetheless, believe me, when you live someplace where the gospel is not widespread, it just seems like there is a church every 100 feet here. You know, okay, they may not be the same flavor as us, but in many times the gospel is still there. You can turn on the television. I don't have any idea how many Christian television channels there are, Christian radio stations. I have no idea. There are a lot. And the further south and east you go, the more there are. You turn on the radio, that's almost all that's on there. It's crazy. And I understand a lot of them are wacko, but there's still this presence of the gospel. And in many cases, that keeps the devil at bay because people are praying. You're praying here this morning. And I'm so grateful for a church that believes in prayer. It knows that God changes history as a result of that. So you have this reality that we live in this world where so few people have still never heard. So many people have still never heard. What do you do with that? What do you do with that? Where do you go from here? I don't think that just continuing to do what we've always done is going to make that happen. That there needs to be a paradigm shift someplace where we look more seriously at this task. I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. I'm dismayed when I realize that I'm talking to someone who has never in their life even actually considered the idea of missions. Faithful believers. Just like missions was for other people, you know? And granted, I'm not one of those people that God had to threaten me with illness and, to get me to be a missionary. You hear those testimonies, I resisted. No. I longed to be a missionary. I dreamt of being a missionary. I just knew I didn't have what it took, When I was about 14, shortly after I was saved, I started reading those little biographies, those 100-page biographies of David Livingstone, Adoniram Judson, and Hudson Taylor, different things, And I thought, man, that would be so awesome. But they were written about guys, over 100 years ago. And I'm thinking, I wonder what it's like now. And then I remember reading a book called The Lords of the Earth. And it's a story of missions in Irian Jaya in Indonesia. It's the Indonesian side of the island of New Guinea. And a missionary that was martyred there in 1966. Like, oh. I know what I was doing in 1966, and it brought it right down to home for me. And I was dreaming, Lord, maybe I could do that. And it dismays me to know that there are people that just had never even thought of it. How is that possible when we live in a world where so few people have heard? Well, one of the things about that is that people have to be willing to go to the hard places. And sometimes what wasn't a hard place can become a hard place. I mentioned in Sunday school the war in Ivory Coast. It changed the whole landscape for us. One of the things that, I grew up in Kansas, in Shawnee, Kansas, and, I didn't know anything about missions. And when we get to the field, we realize, man, there's a lot of missionaries here. All kind of flavors. Well, you make friends with some of them, and it creates this whole community. There's a community of missionaries, and it plays a big role in your life. Creates fellowship for you and friendship, and it really plays a big role. It's something we never even dreamt of, never thought of it. And it really is important because we turn in several circles. You have like the church family circle that's various economic strata, and then you have the wealthy local people strata, which often crisscrosses with the French group. We had a lot of French people in Côte d'Ivoire at the time. And then you have the international expat circle, and sometimes they intermingle, not always. And then you have the missionary circle. And I don't know, for some reason, we would often be involved in these other circles, but we were the only missionaries there. Like the French circle, if we were invited to an activity among them, we were the only missionaries there because they just didn't do that. And so with the war, it changed our landscape. Now, it's about a 250-mile radius from us to get to the next missionary. We are the only missionaries in our city, 380,000 people. The city where we used to live, Bouake, is now something like 1 million people. There are none. Our son will arrive there in December, and his family. They're in France right now in language school. So now there'll be 2 of us in that 60-mile radius. But you have to go 3.5 hours south to the first missionaries. You have to go 5 hours north to the next missionaries. You have to go 4 hours east. West, I don't know how far you'd have to go, a long way. To the southwest. And it changed. Over the period of our career, there have been different things that made it challenging. You know, when you first go, okay, it's new, so that makes it challenging. You have culture shock and all that. And culture shock is one of those things like you can learn about it and you can explain it. Until you've experienced it, you don't understand it. You know, and we see it like in our granddaughters. They're 2, 4, and 6, living in France. And their parents are like, you know, what's going on? Why are they? That's cultural stress. You know, it's going to school in a different language and kids talking about things they don't understand. It just creates this stress. And so we get that. That's one of the phases. And then your kids start going away to college. And they're in America and you're in Africa. And, you know, our oldest daughter was a freshman in college and got pneumonia. And she calls us crying, you know, and like, we're so far away. Just, that passes. It's just a normal thing. Your kids get up and move away, you know. And then you have grandchildren. That was the most difficult. And you leave your grandchildren in America and you go to Africa. And it's just so far away. And now you have this new phase, you know. And one of the things is that we have to go to hard places. In Acts chapter 14, Apostle Paul is on his very first missionary journey. And you know how it starts in Acts 13. And they all laid their hands on them and they sent them away. The idea of that passage is that we really would have liked to keep them, but because God called them, we let them go. You know, what we're looking for is the best of the best. We're not looking for the people who couldn't do anything anywhere else. Though I know some missionaries like that. And what's interesting to me, people who would never be cool in their own culture can make it cross-culturally because nobody knows. They're not cool. Honestly, you know? And we know a lot of missionaries like that. Like if they were in America, I'm not sure they would succeed. But overseas, it doesn't matter. All they have to do is work hard, you know, and live faithfully, and God will do this. It's an amazing thing. Well, Apostle Paul is on his first journey, he and Barnabas, and they come to Iconium, and sure enough, the people raise up against them. The Jews are following them around. It says in verse 5 of chapter 14, and when there was an assault made both of the Gentiles, an assault, that's a pretty serious word, made both of the Gentiles and also of the Jews with their rulers to use them despitefully and to stone them. They were aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth round about, and there they preached the gospel. So they found out that someone was after them. And I've had experiences like that, you know, where you find out ahead of time that someone is laying in wait or whatever. One of the funniest for me is during the war, you know, there's no one there. And I had this, it's an oxymoron, Suzuki Jeep, okay? I had a Suzuki Jeep. I sold my old 1983 Jeep for a 1993 Jeep, so I really upgraded. This is 2004 now. And I'm traveling back and forth to the village. The only one of our churches that survived the war, we were outside the war zone with this church. But it borders a lake that is the front. And so people are running back and forth across the lake. So I'm running around back and forth with this Jeep, and I get up there and I blow my engine. And we had rebuilt the engine. They didn't change the oil pump, and anyways, engine seized up. Sounds like a terrible thing, but in a Suzuki, it's not a big deal. So I walked down to the pastor's house in the village near there to get him to take me on his moped up to the dam where I could get a phone signal and call Barbara to call the mechanic to come out and get me to, Anyway, while I'm walking to the village, to his house, I see these French soldiers like running from tree to tree and building to building. And I'm thinking, God, they must be on maneuvers or something. I don't know. It was weird. So I go in the house, talk to the pastor. We come out, and the yard is full of French soldiers. Like, okay. And I said, what are you guys doing? Oh, we're just like taking a census of all the expats in the area. And I, okay, really? And he starts asking me questions. So do you know this person? Do you know that person? Do you take this road and whatever? And do you have a business card that can prove who you are? And, it was kind of odd, but so I didn't think much about it. So after he left, the pastor said, that was no census. That was an inquiry. They want to know who you are and what you're doing. Come to find out, they thought I was running guns. Because to them, they're in their armored vehicles, in high alert, all carrying guns and helmets and flaks and, the whole thing. And I'm in this Suzuki Jeep wearing a baseball cap, singing out the window, They just can't imagine. Like, why would you be here if it wasn't for money? Because they can't imagine. And so I get that. You learn to be wary. And this is what happened to them. Well, they go on. And they get to Lystra. It says, and there came thither certain Jews, verse 19, Verse 19, there came to them certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. Howbeit, as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up, and he came to the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. It's always funny to me how the Bible just like shares a story like that and moves on like no big deal, but we're talking about stoning here, And I don't know if you've ever seen a video or witnessed anything like that, but in Abidjan, during one of the political turmoils there, a bunch of Muslims went to one of our sister churches planning to burn the church down. And now understand, they didn't show up with matches, okay? They had butane bottles like you'd use for camping or your barbecue grill with flamethrowers on them, and they planned to burn this church down. And so they started in the church. And so while it's on fire, the smoke starts billowing in the pastor's house, which is attached to the back of the church. It'd be like this extended another 20 feet. That was a house back there. And so they start running out the side door. Well, the people knew what would happen. So as they're running out, they're standing out with rocks about this big and start pummeling them with rocks. And one young man got knocked down. And they stoned him. So when I saw him in the hospital a couple of days later, he was unrecognizable. He was so swollen, like head to toe swollen. And his face disfigured. And to be stoned is a horrific thing. Well, they stoned the Apostle Paul. They thought he was dead. And then the Bible says, and he got up and he left. It could have been like, okay, let's get him up. I don't know, It said he stood up and they just went on like no big deal. But it's very possible that this is where the Apostle Paul got that thorn that he prayed about being taken away. He could have been maimed by this, permanently maimed. It's a terrible, terrible thing. But what's interesting is that they turned around and they went back through Lystra again. It was during the war, and I was praying like, Lord, what do we do? What do we do here? And God really pointed this passage out to me. It's like, just because it's dangerous doesn't mean you don't go. Just because it's hard doesn't mean you don't go. And I hear that all the time. God closed the door this way or that way, and then really all it is dangerous. And people do ask me, and I say this with a little caution, because when Congo flared up, we did leave. But it was because of the children. There were no schools, there were no hospitals, everything was shut down. I don't know how people were eating, honestly, other than just stuff coming in from villages, African food, and which is okay, but you can't, when you don't grow up on it, it's hard to sustain your health. just on African food. And really, I think what it came down to is, am I willing to lay my life down for the gospel? Oh yeah, just like that, without a doubt. The guy who had my car, Konate, when, I told him one time, a guy threatened me real seriously, and I told him, I said, I'm not afraid to die. I'm not even a little afraid to die. But nobody wants to die because some idiot accidentally pulled the trigger because he was stoned. Now you're dead, and he's going, oh man, didn't mean to do that. Nobody wants to die like that. Funny aside to that story is he dismissed it like no big deal. Oh, these guys are tough, they're mercenaries, whatever. Well, the next day they shot that guy in the foot to tell him to chill out. And don't mess with the pastor. Okay. I'm willing, perfectly willing, to lay down my life for the gospel. But I don't know that you have the right to make that decision for your children. I think they need to make that decision on their own. If you're already there and it happens, okay, that's one thing. But to move into a situation that is like that, because we were away when it flared up, to move into a situation like that is a whole different thing. So in Cote d'Ivoire, we didn't leave because our kids were all grown and gone. And I remembered when this all happened, Barbara and I talking, we were very young, saying, maybe God gave us our children really young because one day we're going to be doing something dangerous that you can't have children to do that. And here we are. It didn't seem so dangerous, but that's just grace. People ask me all the time, weren't you afraid? No, I wasn't. And that's just grace. Because people who were afraid left. And God gave me the grace to stay, maybe just because he knew I was going to stay. So one of the things about getting engaged in this unfinished task is people have to be willing to go to some hard places. Have to be willing for it to be difficult. We sang today, be purified like gold. I remember a good friend of mine in a period of hardship, he was saying, are we gold yet? This can finish any time now. And, life is wonderful, but it is not easy. Today, I have a niece in California who seems to be dying. 2.5 years ago, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. Never smoked a day in her life. She's healthy, but we think probably she lived in a neighborhood that has radon in it. She and her sister-in-law by marriage both got it at the same time. Her sister-in-law died almost 2 years ago. Because my niece had the means to be able to pursue an experimental treatment in California. Every time she goes, it's $65,000. Cash. And you have to live in California for that month or whatever it is. It's just crazy. This time when she went, she lives in Milwaukee. This time when she went, she was too weak to walk. She can't talk because the tumor in her lung, even though it's dead, is pressing on her esophagus, and so now she can't talk. And they called in family 2 days ago. Those are hard things that we face. But that is just part of life. Understand that. My brother always said, ain't none of us getting out of this alive, unless the Lord returns. Life does move on. Most of my friends are retired now. Most of my colleagues are retiring. And life moves on. But we have to be willing, knowing that it's in God's hands. And we just trust him for his call on our lives, and we do what he asks us to do. People used to say to us during the war, it's like, well, if you're doing what God wants you to do, he'll protect you. That is not in here, folks. That is not in here. It's a wonderful thought. The safest place to be is in the center of God's will. Tell that to Stephen, or Peter, or James, or John. That's just not part of the deal. And that's okay. It's in his hands. Sure, it creates regrets and it creates sadness, but it's in his hands. So what do we do in the face of the fact that 2/3 of the world never heard? We engage. We engage. It means that we allot more time and effort to prayer. I mentioned earlier, every believer should be a student of geography. It's like when I say Côte d'Ivoire, man, you should know right where that is. And I don't expect you to know where Ouagadougou is in Yamoussoukro, okay? Even though it's fun to say. You know, but at the same time, you should know what's going on there. And I know a lot of people that's where their burden came from, is praying around the globe, praying in an atlas, getting Joshua Project books and praying for these unreached people groups, because it does make an impact. My family, we used to have a game called Geographax, and we could not be beat. My kids knew where all those countries, at the time there were 58 countries in Africa. And my daughter could name all of them and all the capitals. Like most people, they don't even know there are 58 countries in Africa. They think Africa's a country, you know? We have to be willing and capable of going to these hard places. It requires engaging. We pray. Sometimes it's about giving. And I know every missionary comes and talks about prayer and giving. A little girl gave me this dollar bill about 35 years ago, maybe 38 years ago. At the time, you could have bought a cup of coffee with it. Yeah, I think you could have bought a cup of coffee and a donut with it. Huh. We stopped twice on the way here for my addiction this morning, and they were $1.80, you know, out of paper cups. But in the hands of my God, this can be the difference in the gospel arriving or not. Because we've lived where that relationship is very, very real. Like, you can only do what you have the finances to do. There have been times where we literally could not go where we had an invitation to go because there was no funding for the fuel that it would take to get there. And the idea that money could stand between the gospel arriving or not is a despicable thought, but it's reality. It is reality. I believe that God will provide what He has intended for you to do, but He only does that when people respond in obedience to what He's calling them to do. And I mentioned in Sunday school, sometimes He asks people to give sacrificially. We all live with the idea of give and it'll be given to you. We all live with this idea that you cannot outgive God. And I believe that's true, but it doesn't mean He's going to replace it financially, necessarily. Some people, He funds so that they can give beyond belief. Other people give sacrificially and do without. I had a good friend. He is a business associate, actually. I was in business in the Kansas City area before I became missionaries, as well as being associate pastor in our church. And he made a lot of money, in the hundreds of thousands a year. He could have driven any car he wanted. He could have lived anywhere he wanted. This is in the 70s, you know. It was a lot of money. He didn't. He drove like a 1970 Plymouth, and he lived in a 3-bedroom ranch-style house in a regular neighborhood because he wanted to be able to give the rest of it away. And he gave far more than most people will ever make just because he wanted to be that guy that did that. He was just living in obedience. I think I'm the only person that knew that any idea what he made is because of our association in business. And I think I found it out because we went to the bank to sign a note, and the bank acted a whole lot different toward him than they did me. I'm thinking, so what's going on here anyway, you know? And maybe you could be that person, knowing. I remember arriving in a village one time. It was one of the villages, maybe let me step back. We'd been working about a year in Congo, and a guy showed up at my gate with a letter. And it said, "Dear missionary, would you please come to our village and start one of those Baptist churches in our town?" I'm thinking, what? Is this for real? You know, like, do you know a chamber of commerce that has ever written to a missionary and say, "Would you please come start one of those Baptist churches in our town?" I know some chambers that have written to church planters and say, "We don't need another church in our town." We're good. Well, I no more than got that letter filed away, and another one came. And before it was over, I had a file about a half-inch thick of places asking us to come and start churches in their village. And I remember heading in that direction and realized we don't have enough fuel to get there, and we don't have enough money to buy the fuel to get there. And we shortened the trip. We went someplace else instead. It wasn't foiled, but we didn't get there, and honestly, we never got there. And that's just a result of money. And that's a scary thing. It's a scary thing. I don't want to be holding on to stuff when the gospel can't reach certain places because of lack of money. It may mean giving up your small ambitions. For us to engage, it requires people. It requires some good people, kids who are intelligent that could have done anything. I have several friends that are missionaries. Honestly, they would have succeeded no matter what they did. They're just so brilliant and so hardworking. And God called them, and they said willingly, absolutely. I mean, why would you ever want to do anything different if you have this opportunity? If God calls you, regardless of what you think of our president, at any stage in the history of America, if the president of the United States calls and said, hey, would you meet with me tomorrow? People go, just like that. If you got a call this afternoon, said, I'm sending a jet for you, would you get on it and be here tonight? You'd go. You'd skip church tonight to go talk to the president. When you got back, people would say, so what did the president want? Oh, he has a job for me. Really? You going to take it? Well, I'm thinking about it. What are you going to be doing? He wants me to empty the wastebaskets at the White House. Are you kidding? For the president? And we just think it's a wonderful thing when people in power and people that are important give us important things to do or unimportant things to do. God calls. God calls. And people say, don't you have something else I could do? Seriously? God calls. And people say, no, I don't think I want to do that. I'm scared. I'm not qualified. Folks, I am the poster child for unqualified. When we got to Kinshasa at the time was about 6 million people, so it's all of Kansas and Missouri together. We couldn't say bonjour in a way that anyone could understand it. We did not know a living soul in that city. We didn't know where we were going to live. We didn't know what we were going to do. We just showed up. And young missionaries ask us now, what? How? Why would you do that? There wasn't no other choice. There wasn't any communication. A letter took 6 weeks to go one way and back again. It took 3 months for a letter to turn around with a response. Nobody had any phones. We never dreamt of having a telephone. You just go because God said go. So we get there. We're standing there like looking around like, now what? The kids are all looking. Barbara's looking at me like, now what? And I'm looking at God saying, yeah, now what? And she sees this guy standing over there on the outside of the glass in the passport control, and it says M. Tim. Come to find out, it means Monsieur Tim. Barbara said, could that be you? I'm like, how could it be me? So I just walked up to him and I said, I'm Tim Downs. Are you looking for me? He said, yeah, I am. Okay, come with me. Okay, we don't know who he was or where we're going, but we're going with him. Come to find out, there was a missionary family in Kinshasa that somehow through the grapevine heard that we were coming. And there was a Baptist family at the embassy working in communications that had been looking for Baptist missionaries in Kinshasa. And they got together and arranged for someone to pick us up at the airport. Who knew? Only God does those things. And so when you think, but I could never do that. No one can ever do that. We just respond and trust God to work it out. And it is amazing He does. Just this most recent trip to Kinshasa, I'm thinking, how in the world are we going to get up country? Are we going to borrow a car, rent a car? How in the world are we going to get up there? It's a 2-day trip. Hard 2-day trip. And the lawyer says, oh, by the way, the senator is going to loan us her truck. Like, oh, okay, and her driver. That works. Free. God just goes before you. Let me encourage you this morning. Stop. Take some time and ask God, Lord, what is my place in this task that is so far unachieved, unfinished? What is my place? And I know when we were young, when we were on deputation, and it sounds really pious to say, your prayer is more important than your money. And that sounds important, but, the reason we were kind of going around church to church partly is to raise money. And we're thinking, your prayer is really important, but your money really is too. But then we got there, and we realized, oh, yeah, money pushes the work forward, money enables us to stay here, but your prayer keeps us alive. When I had a car wreck in 1989, everybody that was there knew I died. And that was a testimony spread all over that city. Is the devil tried to kill that missionary, but God said, not just yet. Bleeding, head wound, unconscious, that's dead in Africa. And that story came back up while I was there last month. People were like, oh yeah, man, I remember that. Everybody had heard about it. So believe me, your prayer keeps us alive. When 1994, Barbara got black water fever. And a generation ago, it meant your time is done. Your water turns black, start getting your affairs in order. And so we're nervous. We didn't know exactly at the time what the story was, but we knew she was really, really sick. I'm calling her dad from a payphone outside the hospital saying, Barbara's back in the hospital again. I just wanted you to know. And he said, well, is she going to be okay? And I said, I think so. I hope so. I think, you take his daughter to Africa, you're supposed to bring her back. And you didn't know. There's no way for anyone to know what's going on. But because you pray faithfully, God intervenes. And He does something different than He would have done. Take some people who are willing to pay a price. When we first arrived, we were staying in this embassy compound with an embassy family, and it came a knock at the door. We're like, that's weird. People knocking at the door. It almost have to be a guard because it's secure. You can't get in there. Well, this old couple, he was 70 at the time. Doesn't sound so old anymore, but he looked old. He was 70. They're standing there at the door. He had just talked his way through. Everybody knew who he was, and he spoke 10 languages or whatever, and he grew up there. We meet them. They're Bob and Winnie Grings. And they said, yeah, we just came 2 weeks down the river in a dugout canoe. I'm like, what? Is this a movie? And they just to meet us. They just wanted to meet us. Well, we learned their story. Bob's father first arrived in Congo in 1917. He left, went home on furlough. By now they've got 6 kids. It's 1934, and they're ready to go back. Well, they didn't have any money. It was 1934, right after the Depression. They're still during the Depression. They didn't have any money, and so they chartered passage on the very last sailing ship that was still going transatlantic. So they're on this ship going across the ocean, and they get in a big storm, and the thing sinks 500 miles off the coast of the Azores. And they're floating around in a lifeboat. It turned out to be just one day in the lifeboat because a big freighter had been blown off course too and picked them up the very first day. And Mrs. Grings turns to her husband, and she asks him, you think God's trying to tell us not to go to Congo? He said, no. He's trying to tell us not to go to Congo with all that stuff. And they literally arrived with the clothes they were wearing. And they went to a place called the Bankutu Forest. It's so remote that the Africans I was talking to a month ago didn't even know where it was, even though they grew up 2 hours from there. The Bankutu Forest is very, very remote. It's dark. And Mrs. Grings got black water fever. And her children dug her grave in that forest after she passed. But they stayed on the field, and today there are hundreds of churches as a result of that family. Every child became a missionary. Every grandchild became a missionary. Most of the great-grandchildren are missionaries. It's crazy. And the price they paid was enormous. We all can engage at some level. You don't have to go to the Bankutu forest to be engaged, but you have to do something to be engaged. You have to take it seriously. You have to be willing and intentional about it. You may be here this morning, you don't even know what I'm talking about. I remember those days. First time somebody said, hey, if you've never been saved, you need to do that when you get to church on Sunday. I had no idea what he was talking about. We talk about being a believer, we talk about being a child of God, and if you're here and you're wondering, what happens after you die? Where do you go? The Bible is very clear. Someone, if you want to know, someone will show you from the Word of God. Not our philosophy, not our personal teachings, not our ideas. We will show you from the Bible what God says about how you can know that you have eternal life. Maybe you're here this morning and, man, you've got big dreams. Let me encourage you, give up your small ambitions. I don't care how great we become in this world, how wealthy we become. Life is a monopoly game. You go around and around and around and around, and when it's all over, you put it all back in the box and put it away. Nothing goes with us. We may as well give it away. Trust God to do something extraordinary with it. Stand with me if you would, please. Heads bowed.